Hello. It is day 19. Last night I slept decently well. The night before was really bad, so yesterday I was so tired. Okay. Yesterday was a really good chapter. It was all about like the rich robber barons of the 1910s and 20s and how they had just like these like amazing estates in Long Island. And you know that Robert Moses is going to come in here, like plow in and make parks and beaches and stuff. But it was really fun to read about all the familiar names like JP Morgan and the Carnegies, and then Andrew Carnegie's like business partner, the Mr. Phipps, who I didn't know before, but who had a really like crazy, unnecessarily large estate. Okay. Wow. You're back. What did you buy today? I actually can't guess. I don't know. I probably recommended something that I'm like forgetting now. The book. This book? Or was it oh my gosh, yeah, it is so big. It's really I was yesterday I was being like, look to one of my friends who came over. I was like, like I'm getting so far, and she was like she like couldn't tell I was joking, but I was like, no, like I'm really proud. This is an accomplishment. It's also heavy. Like I've been stopped at TSA at the airport before because of having big books. And so when I brought this one through, I like specifically put it at the top of my suitcase in case they asked me to take it out. But they didn't. They didn't. I felt kind of cool when they were like, "We have a suspicious item in your suitcase." And then it was just a book. I can't even remember what book it was. Oh, it was the book it's a book called The Gene by like Siddhartha Mukherjee. I don't know how to say his name, but it was really good. I actually didn't read it all the way through though. It was kind of like this where I started it really strong, but I quit, which I'm not going to do with this one. Okay. As the families drove, they could see on either side of them, through gates set in stone walls or through the openings in wooden fences, the beautiful meadows they had come for. The families that drive to Long Island from New York City. Stretching endlessly and emptily to the cool trees beyond. Also, it's page 153. Oh, hello! Coming from Durban, what's South Africa? Wow, that is. I don't even know what time it is there. Like, evening? Stretching endlessly and emptily to the cool trees beyond. We're talking about the really rich private houses on Long Island right now. But the meadows and trees were not for them. The gates would be locked, and men carrying shotguns and holding fierce dogs on straining leashes would point eastward, telling the families there were no parks open to them further along. There was no shade on Northern Boulevard, and the children became cranky early. In desperation, ignoring the no trespassing private property signs that lined the road, fathers would turn onto the narrow strip of grass between the boulevard and the wall paralleling it, and, despite the dust and the fumes from the passing cars, would try to picnic there. 7 p.m. Cool. I've never been, but I really want to go. And the CEO, sorry, I'm like talking to okay, South Africa, I've always wanted to go. And the CEO of Wikipedia, her name's Mariana. She feels new, but it's probably been a year now. Yeah, probably about a year. Maybe 2 years even. And she is from there, and she lives there most of the year, except for when she's in San Francisco for work stuff. And she told me that if I go, I can visit her house. So I was like, oh, that's even more motivation to go someday. But I don't remember which city she lives in. Okay, so people are having picnics in like the middle of the highway. Later in Oyster Bay Town and Huntington, they would come to parks, tiny but nonetheless parks. But as they approached them, they would see policemen at their entrances, and the policemen would wave them on, explaining that they were reserved for township residents. There were, the policemen shouted, parks open further along. Of those who turned off the boulevard trying to find a beach, the lucky ones found a spot on the 5 rocky strips on the Glen Cove Peninsula. The others, searching mile after mile for a piece of beach not marked private, seldom even got close enough to glimpse the water, for most of the roads down to it had locked gates across them. They would turn south again, heading back to the boulevard. The more persistent, who determined to head east until they discovered some place to swim or picnic, found the road becoming worse and worse. They would see Long Island villagers sitting on the fences and laughing at the families who, because of engine overheating or in a desperate try at a piece of grass, pulled off the road. The line of cars was so solid, the radiator of one almost touching the tailgate of the one before it, that once out of the line, it was hard for a car to get back in. And it was fun, the villagers said, to watch them try. At the head of Hempstead Harbor, this is crazy, just like the really rich people hogging all the good beachy land and then being mean to the tourists. Also, my cat is being so cute. I want you to see her. Okay, maybe she'll sit in my lap. Let's see. It would be really nice if she did. There she is. If you see any of my messy room behind me. Oh, actually good. This side is not so bad. The other side, right beyond the camera, it's like worse than a pile of dirty clothes. It's a mix of clean clothes and dirty clothes on the floor, which I'll take care of soon. At the head of Hempstead Harbor, the inlet that separates the Sands Point and Glen Cove peninsulas, Northern Boulevard dipped down, curving and winding, rutted and potholed, unpaved in one stretch, and became the main street of Roslyn Village. It narrowed as its width was cut by sidewalks in front of little stores, and then on one side of the town, wound upward again before resuming its eastern course. Roslynites, watching the endless line of cars, said it took 2 hours just to get through town. But this was, of course, an exaggeration. In 1923, state officials clocked it on successive Sundays and found that you could make it in an hour and a quarter to get through town because of all the traffic. The officials also determined the length of time it took on an average Sunday to get from the Queensboro Bridge in New York to Huntington in Long Island, a distance of 32.4 miles. The time was 4 hours. Wow. If the New Yorkers, I'm trying to think, I did a marathon one time, and so I was like trying to compare my pace, and I really think that if I were like at my peak training or whatever, and if I had kept up my marathon pace, I would probably be neck and neck with the cars at that point because they're in such a standstill. Also, look at her. She's so excited. If the New Yorkers stayed on Northern Boulevard long enough, there were indeed, after the estates and guards of the Gold Coast had been left behind. What? If the New Yorkers stayed on Northern Boulevard long enough, there were indeed, after the estates and guards of the Gold Coast had been left behind, and even if the promised parks farther along never materialized, plenty of quiet places with grass and trees in which one could picnic. Smithtown, the township beyond Huntington, alone, had 92.5 acres of cemeteries. The fallen tombstones made excellent picnic tables. When the cemeteries were filled, there were always little farms, for although the Suffolk farmers were as determined as the barons to keep the foreigners off their lands, they couldn't afford guards to help them do it, and they never seemed to have enough dogs and sons with pitchforks to do the job thoroughly, although they certainly tried. New Yorkers could even swim in Smithtown if they found a beach whose owner wasn't around. Everyone knew that they could because every Monday newspapers carry stories about the city residents who, swimming in the choppy sound without the permission of lifeguards, had drowned in Smithtown waters. Pearl, do you like it? Pearl's really passionate about urbanism. Most New Yorkers, however, didn't last to Smithtown. They turned around and slunk home, eating their picnic lunches in their cars, washing them down with bitterness and frustration. If they swam on Long Island, they swam in their cars in their sweat. Northern Boulevard was not, of course, the only route to the North Shore from New York. There was also Jericho Turnpike. There was one difference between Northern Boulevard and Jericho Turnpike. Jericho Turnpike was 2 feet narrower. Okay. I'm going to see if we can get in the same. Pearl, you got to get in the shot. And the greed of the robber barons had not been satisfied by the riches of the North Shore. Led by Horace O. Havemeyer, the, quote, Sultan of Sugar, a group of them had seized the choicest areas of the South Shore, a series of promontories below East Islip that jut out into the Great South Bay about midway along its 60-mile length. They lived there in splendor equal to that of the North Shore, and they displayed an equal determination to keep their privacy unimpaired. When one of their number, Julian T. Davies, died in 1922, they feared that his estate might be bought by some undesirable, or worse, subdivided. A group of them, led by Havemeyer and his brother-in-law, W. Kingsland Macy, decided to turn it into a private club. The obstacles might have deterred less determined men. Davies had owned only 231 acres, and most of them were marshland that were covered by water at tide high, so that there was only enough solid land for a 9-hole golf course. Oh, so short. Only a 9-hole golf course. Thanks for the marathon thing, but I think my pace was like 8 minutes and 30 seconds-ish. But it was like 5 years ago, so I don't remember my final time. But I want to say, if I'm lying, it's not because it's not on purpose. I'm sure you could Google it. My fastest time was at the Indianapolis Marathon, and it was like 3:40 or something. Yeah, she does. She likes reading. Okay, so this guy can only have a 9-hole golf course. To design the course, they brought over an Englishman who was the most famous golf course designer in the world. To help the members with their swings, they hired a famous touring professional. They staffed the kitchen with the best chefs they could find. For those members who wanted to sail, they built a large boat basin. And when all was ready, they thought of a name, the Timber Point Club, and they opened the club to exactly 100 persons. Small club. Quote, you could play golf there on a weekend, and if there were 2 other golfers on the whole course, you considered the place crowded, recalls Robert Hollins, the son of one of the members. That place was empty. And that was exactly how the members wanted it. As they toured the majestic course that sloped down to the bay, men in caps and knickerbockers and long socks, ladies in long pleated skirts and midi blouses, they considered the lack of people as big an asset as the view. In 1923, Suffolk County established a mosquito control commission and asked various members of the club for contributions. God, the mosquitoes in the summer were unbelievable on that golf course, Holland says. You'd look at the fellow you were playing with, and there might be 20 on his face. But most timber pointers gave nothing. If the commission got rid of the mosquitoes, Mrs. Hollins explained, more, quote, foreigners might find the South Shore attractive and try to live there. I'd rather have the mosquitoes, she told her friends. These people are crazy. To keep the point out was to keep the public out was worth any price. When the property adjoining the Timber Point Club, a 1,500-acre estate owned by an eccentric old millionaire who had never been one of them anyway, George C. Taylor, came on the market after his death, the Timber Pointers raised $250,000 to buy it. Then they hired caretakers, stocked it with herds of deer and flocks of wild pheasant, all for less than 10 days of hunting a year, and an additional guarantee that they would never have to look over from their golf course and see on the land adjoining it anyone they didn't know. Thanks to the barons and the baymen, the sandy beaches of the South Shore were as thoroughly closed off to New York as the rocky beaches of the North. Those New Yorkers who could not afford the exorbitant charges at Long Beach or squeeze into the limited public area of the beach there were shunted along the South Shore from village to village until they reached the flat, unshaded, bleak potato fields of Suffolk County. And the shunting on the South Shore was along Merrick Road an artery as narrow as Northern Boulevard and even more congested, which crossed the clogged downtown areas of a dozen South Shore villages and was intersected at half 100 locations by the tracks of the Long Island Railroad, so that every time a train came through, the line of cars, oh, this is horrible. Every time a train came through, the line of cars, miles long, would have to stop and wait until the crossing gates went up again. And still, the need was so great that every summer, weekend families from New York flocked to Long Island, trying Jericho Turnpike instead of Northern Boulevard, or trying the South Shore instead of the North, or a side road they had noticed the weekend before and which would, they felt sure, lead to a beach they could use. An endless eastward bound stream of baseless hope that lasted from dawn to late afternoon. And all forecasts showed that the need would rapidly grow greater still. The city's population, which had increased by 1 million persons during the past 10 years, was expected to increase by another 1 million during the next 10. I got a big coffee today. I have to go before I live right next to a Dunkin' Donuts, and so I wanted to go before I move next week because I'll miss being so close. In the past, given the need, therefore, and the possibility that Long Island could meet it, the thoughts of reformers interested in parks had for years turned first to the island. Here, they all saw, was the land of the greatest opportunity. But they also saw, even the most unrealistic of them, that the amount of power with which they had to contend on Long Island was such that efforts to create parks there seemed, even to themselves, foredoomed. In the past, the governments that created parks had been the governments of areas in which the parks would be located. The township and village governments on Long Island would never create such parks. Conservationists had begun to talk about state parks, but a state park had to be created by a state, and New York state legislature was controlled by the Long Island Barons. A dozen proposals by the good government organizations for Long Island parks had been introduced in that legislature. Not one had ever made it out of committee. The scope of the problem discouraged reformers as much as the political difficulties involved. Parks large enough to serve any appreciable portion of New York City's millions would have to be measured in the hundreds of acres. And since Long Island was run almost entirely by hostile local governments and landowners, how could these acres possibly be obtained? By purchase, Long Island property was valuable, immensely valuable in the hills and along the beachfront where parks should be located. By condemnation of valuable property on the scale required would be fantastically expensive, a fact unheard of in America. In fact, unheard of in America. And since the barons' battalions of lawyers could be expected to fight condemnation with every tactic available, the proceedings would take years. And if somehow the parks were created, how would people get to them? Long highways would be required, and their rights of way would necessarily cross hundreds, if not thousands, of different properties. And that meant hundreds, if not thousands, of landowners who would be ready to fight, and that would mean hundreds and thousands of additional condemnation proceedings. The reformers realized that even in the unlikely event that they won on Long Island, that they actually succeeded in unhorsing the power barons, they wouldn't know what to do with their victory. The problem was so big, the reformers thought, it was insoluble. By 1922, their park discussions concerned mainly the creation of more small playgrounds in the city and the improvement of playground equipment. Oh yay, we have a roads engineer here. Yeah, it is the stories of the congestion of like all the millions of people trying to get out of the city is crazy. It makes me appreciate that the traffic now, even though it's bad, isn't worse when I'm trying to like get to the airport or whatever. Often when Bob Moses went home at night, he would be coming from such park discussions because Al Smith, the governor, trying to maintain his liaison with reform groups in preparation for another run for governor, frequently asked him to be the observer at reformers' conferences. Moses, tended to such discussions only cursory attention. With his attacks on Governor Miller occupying his time, Al Smith was the governor, and then there was a new governor, Miller, but Al Smith wants to become governor again, if you didn't remember that. With attacks on Governor Miller occupying his time, wordy debates over whether a playground site should be on 14th or 15th Street interested him not at all. But during the summer of 1922, when Bob Moses went home, he went to Long Island. Invited to weekends in Babylon, which is in Long Island, by friends during 1921, he and Mary had fallen in love with the town, with the bay, with the whole South Shore. In 1922, they rented a bungalow of their own for the summer. So when the discussions on parks ended, he would hurry to the Long Island Railroad station and catch a train on the South Shore line. The trips from and to the city took over an hour. 45 years later, Moses could still reel off without effort the names of the stops as the conductors had chanted them: Valley Stream, Lynbrook, Oceanside, Rockville Center, Freeport, Merrick, Amityville, Lindenhurst, and Babylon. And the train was hot. Moses would try to bury himself in work, but every so often he would look up and glance out the window. And after a while, he began to notice that, while most of the route was filled with one-family homes, there were, in between some of the villages, thick, leafy bands of woods, and gleaming brightly through the trees, the blue water of ponds with streams. Pearl is still in my lap, and she is enjoying the book. The woods were all to the north of the railroad, the left-hand side of the train going out to Babylon, and the right hand going into the city. Bob Moses began now always to sit on the side nearest to them. It was the 1920s. The men around him would be sitting studying the stock market quotations in their newspapers. Bob Moses sat and stared out the train window. One weekend he went to Babylon Town Hall and asked what the woods were. An old-timer told him he must be talking about the old Brooklyn water supply properties, the streams in the areas around them in Nassau and Suffolk counties that Brooklyn, which was then an independent city, had purchased in 1874. Oh, wait, interesting. The city of Brooklyn, which was a city and not a borough, purchased water supply from Long Island. Maybe it's not actually that surprising. I don't. But now all of New York's water comes from like upstate in like Westchester County area, Croton Lake Dam stuff. I don't think we get water from Long Island, unless I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure we don't though. Okay, so on Monday morning, Moses stops by the New York Municipal Building and asked a clerk in the Department of Water Supply if the city used those properties. Why, no, the clerk said. It never had. The properties in Long Island where the water dams were. There had never been any need. And, come to think of it, now that New York had acquired the huge Croton and Ashokan reservoirs upstate and built aqueducts from them to the city, there probably never would be. Suddenly, the eyes that had looked at the mudflats below Riverside Drive and seen a great highway and a great park were looking at something else. The eyes that burned with ideas were burning again, and they were focused on Long Island. Most of the I'm on page 158. That sounded like the end of the chapter, but it's not. Most of the water supply properties were set far enough north of Merrick Road, behind blocks of private homes, to be invisible from it. But Merrick Road was the only way of getting close to them. Moses had never learned to drive, but he obtained from Smith the use of a car and chauffeur, and a letter authorizing the guards at the properties to let him enter their gates. On weekend mornings, the line of cars from the city crept east along the road. As the line crept east, Moses, leaving Babylon, would drive west. Arriving at the spot he had marked from the train, Moses would order the chauffeur to drive north along side streets until there was no more road for a car. And then he would get out and walk through the back gates and vacant lots and along footpaths until he reached the gates and could show his letter to the guards. Then he would plunge into the woods. They contained surprises. Through the train windows, he had glimpsed into the woods that lay between Merrick and Freeport a small pond. When he got into those woods on foot, he found the pond, but beyond it, he could see another gleam of water. Reaching that, he found a larger pond, and beyond it, another gleam. Beyond that, there was another. There were 4 ponds linked by a stream that ran due north, and each was larger than the one before. Lilies floated in them. Pickerel and trout flickered beneath the pads. Huge oaks, beeches, birches, and pines surrounded him. And as he tramped steadily north, there seemed no end to them. He was not in a small woods, he realized, but in a forest. It would survey out at more than 700 acres that lay untouched in the heart of Nassau County. There were another 4 ponds. There were another 4 ponds and another wooded 700 acres, stretching south from Wantagh all the way to Great South Bay. There were 595 more near Massapequa. Between Valley Stream and Lynn Brook, there were only 50 acres, but in the center of them was a lake a quarter mile across. And when he entered the woods between Lynn Brook and Rockville Center, he realized he had come to something that dwarfed the others. The thin band of woods that he had seen from a train at that spot ran north for more than 3 miles, broadening as it went. Within the woods were long, rolling meadows. He had heard that somewhere in the woods was a reservoir where a stream had actually been dammed by Brooklyn municipal engineers decades before that couldn't be seen from the train. So he pushed on, trying to find it. With branches slapping at his face and vines tangling his feet, he came at last to a man-made embankment. Scrambling up, he peered over its top, and there before him lay a body of water almost a mile long and half a mile wide. It was much bigger than the big reservoir in Central Park, he realized, and there was more land around it, he guessed, and he turned out to be right. Then there was more land around it than there was in Central Park. Back on Merrick Road, I'm going to do one more page. Back on Merrick Road, Moses saw the cars from the city still creeping along the dust and heat, thousands of them, tens of thousands, crammed with people searching desperately for a little patch of green, a spot of clear water, and most of them destined that weekend would find neither. Destined to find neither. And behind him, not a quarter mile from the road, but unknown to all but 1 in 1,000 of the drivers on it, enclosed to even that one, was land, a vastness of land, overflowing with the fruits they sought. Land that didn't have to be purchased, land that didn't have to be condemned, land that was owned not by governments of Long Island, which viewed the masses of New York City as foreigners, but by the people, by the government of New York City. Land that could be opened to the city's people merely by turning a key. Adding together the acreage of the various tracts of woods, Moses could hardly believe the figures. They totaled 3,500 acres. 3,500 acres just sitting there empty and unused, and ideally situated. All 5 tracts were within 30 miles of Manhattan, within 11 miles of the city line. The woods between Valley Stream and Lynn Brook, in fact, were only 2 miles from that line. The city line, so just like a city train. And what you could do with those acres. There could be hiking trails through the woods, of course, and picnic sites in the clearings, but there could be more. When park planners in general talked about large parks, they talked in terms of keeping them unspoiled and rustic, as close to nature as possible. Even Central Park contained relatively few facilities for any sports other than walking. But Moses saw a different vision. He had noticed meadows back in these woods that seemed just made to order for baseball diamonds, and level spaces with only a few trees that could be cleared for tennis courts. A portion of the biggest tract, the one between Lynn Brook and Rockville Center, seemed almost made to order for a golf course. And why shouldn't people be restricted to looking at the ponds and lakes? Why couldn't they swim in them? That great reservoir alone could cool thousands of sweating youngsters from the city. And there were so many acres available that even after all the facilities were laid out, there would still be vast stretches of woods that could be left untouched except for rustic hiking trails. Oh wow, the longest tunnel on Wikipedia's list of longest tunnels is the Delaware Aqueduct of New York City's water. Wow. That's kind of not somewhere I would like to get stuck in. I wonder if anyone's ever like traveled in like I don't know, if there's like a boat or submarine type thing that you could travel through the aqueduct in. Suddenly, the burning eyes were looking at everything on Long Island in terms of parks. Having fallen in love with the South Shore, Moses had done so with his customary fullness of passion. He kept the Babylon Village librarian scurrying to the cabinet in which were locked the ancient, privately printed books that recounted the legends of the Great South Bay. Buying an old Bayman's old, broad-bottomed, very slow motorboat, partly covered with a canopy, which Mary named the Bob, he put-putted around the bay, following the maps often described in the books, sometimes with Mary and his daughters, but often alone. Heading out to the pier where the Bob was moored, he paused frequently to chat with the sailors who were too old to follow the bay anymore and instead spent their days sitting on upturned oyster barrels looking out over it. And finding him a willing listener to their stories, the old men told him about hidden inlets and about meadows where flocks of wild birds nested, and he spent long days exploring them. Sometimes, in fact, he spent days that were too long then, as he sat in reverie, the bay's ebbing tide that would leave the Bob stranded on a sandbar. After a while, Mary knew what it meant when darkness came and her husband still hadn't returned from the bay. She would call a friend, Harry Fischel, perfect name, who had a shallower draft, and Fischel would go out and bring him in. In the morning, the two men would return to the Bob, now refloated by the flooding tide, and Moses would go back on board with a sandwich Mary had prepared and spend another day on the bay. Okay, I'm going to call it there. It's the top of page 160. Thanks for joining. We're getting there. Look at it. It's, back in the early days when it was just like I was like this far through, I was like, oh, this makes me sad to even look at my progress. But now I'm like, all right, that's a pretty. I wouldn't be embarrassed to be on the subway with like this, although I would like. I think it'd be more cool to be like on the subway like this. You know what I mean? Anyway, yeah, 100 pages to go. 1,002 pages to go. Okay, that is crazy. But you're right. You're right. Okay. See you later. I'll be back for the next 1,002 pages. Maybe not every day, but most days. That every day in the title, I'll keep it there so that the titles are consistent, but I miss days sometimes. Sometimes I just don't have it in me to read aloud about 1920s parks and stuff. Okay. See you later. Yeah, in my head, okay, I was trying to pace it out. The last time I did a little calculation, it was gonna be done by like I think the middle of May or something. I don't know if that's still accurate. I'll have to figure it out later. Goodbye.